Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Today we have a special episode on the rising threat of communism in America, how communist ideology permeated throughout the U.S., notably in the education system, and why people should care. And today we have two special guests with us, author and speaker and host of CounterPunch, Trevor Loudon, as well as host of Talking Points, David Zhang. Let's dive in. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Great to have you.
It's a pleasure, Tiffany. Thanks very much.
Great to be here, Tiffany. Thank you for inviting me.
So the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, just marked its 100th anniversary in power recently with a whole slew of celebrations. And the Chinese leader Xi Jinping issued a quite grim warning to anyone who tries to interfere with, quote, state affairs. And now many in, say, America or other countries in the free world might not think much about this. And they might not think, the Chinese Communist Party has much to do with them. But it seems, especially nowadays, this kind of communist ideology has been seeping into these free worlds. And why do you think that is?
The goal of communism has always been world domination. The communists themselves acknowledge that their system will only work when they have no competition, where there is nowhere to go to, where they have complete dominance all over the world. So it's very hypocritical of the Chinese Communist Party to talk about Western interference in Chinese state affairs, where they've been directly interfering in American and other Western countries' affairs for decades.
So if you were to sum up what communism is about in a sentence, how would you describe it?
The complete centralization of all power and all wealth in a very few totalitarian hands. That's what communism is. It's nothing to do with equal sharing of wealth.
If I had to just give one sentence about what communism really is, it's about hatred. And it's about the hate against someone else. In China, communism has manifested in the form of a class struggle, the very typical writing of Karl Marx, which is that the lower working class has no rights and they don't make any money, and so they must hate on those that do have money, and so they must take over. What's happening in the States is that the people that identify themselves as the lower class, we see now there's a lot of hatred against the other class, which is, in their opinion, is the typical suburban white population. They think that those people are what's causing their own problems. And so fundamentally, communism and Marxism comes down to hate. But there's also another key aspect. Historically, if you read any writings about Marx, we actually know he was very anti-Christ. He believed in Satan, and he was very anti-Christ. And you find in his writing that he hated God. He hated the idea of God. What he did cherish, though, was he really liked Darwin's evolutionary theory, the idea that through competition and through struggles, people can advance. And so the fundamental idea about communism is sort of hate through evolution.
So why do you think this theory gained traction in America, especially since America is founded on, say, God, in God we trust, in liberty? Why do you think these values of hate and atheism took root here?
Because we've been teaching communism in our schools for decades, and it's gone into overdrive in the last few years. Why do so many young American kids hate their own country? Because they have been led to believe that America got rich off slavery. It was set up by rich white slave owners to exploit people, that America got rich by ripping off the third world. These kids do not learn of the exceptionalism of the American Constitution that actually liberated people. That they do not learn that America has saved more people from poverty and tyranny than any other. That it's been the most beneficent force on the planet in the last 200 years. And this is all communist doctrine. This is all communist controlling education to make young kids hate their own country. When the younger generation hates the very foundation of the country and hates the parents who support it. How long can a country survive like that? And that's what the communists have done to this country, to the youth of this country. They've used the education system to indoctrinate people in communism, not telling them it's that. They call it social justice. They call it critical race theory. They call it fighting global warming, open borders, etc. But it's all communism.
So there seems to be a recent shift, especially in the American education system, where it went from empathy and moral values to kind of a political correctness, social unrest, unprecedented racial tensions. And it seems like a lot of people are preaching, say, inclusion and empathy, but some are saying that's been twisted for political means. And both groups think they're in the right. So what do you think led to all this?
Well, the Chinese Communist Party has infiltrated every level of American education, from the Confucius Institutes, which you see on college campuses all over the country, which are indoctrination centers for the CCP line, to the Erickson Institute, which is a major sort of early childhood education center based in Chicago. And they are partnering with the Communist Party of China to bring Chinese propaganda to preschool kids. The Communist Party of China is interfering in virtually every sector of American society, politics, culture, and business, from top to bottom. It's completely endemic.
If we look back before the 60s or even the 50s, in general, the American education system was a lot built on this religious base, but also very traditional, very core value-based systems that's sort of rooted in our history. So there has been a fundamental shift in what education has been about in America. Now, the idea is to promote free thinking in a way that you can think however you want. And this has a lot to do with some of the theories that's been floating around recently. For example, in school, the hottest topic right now is the debate of critical race theory. Now, the problem with a theory like critical race theory is that it reduces and it also cancels every other aspect that makes a person a person. So what it really does is it really just makes everybody reduce them down to a single factor. So, if you belong to this skin color, you then have a certain set of predisposed ideas about yourself and how you should think about yourself. And you're not allowed to think outside of that box. So this brings a problem, and that is we are at a very young age teaching our kids to basically believe in that they were born a certain way, and there's no way that they can get out of this this zone that they're in, which is that they're basically, if you're white, and you come with a certain set of standards about yourself. For example, you might be seen as automatically a racist. Whereas if you're, say, born Asian, or if you're born a Black American, then there's a certain set of predisposed notions about you. And this is actually has to do a lot with what has happened since the 1960s, is a lot of these scholars that went into academia, they taught classes on what they're calling new liberal classics, or the new ways of teaching philosophy, teaching history, teaching classic. And a lot of these ideas are actually very rooted in such as Marxism or socialism. And the idea is that they always have to break from the so-called inequality. And what that is basically they're teaching teachers, and they're telling teachers that, you have to actually tell your kids that, they were born a certain way. And the only way for them to break out of that shell, so those predisposed notions, or these shells that they have formed, is to essentially revolt against your oppressors.
So where do you think these kinds of ideologies started from?
So first, of course, they come from contemporary American history, but longer than that, a lot of them originated from Europe. So for example, the idea of these class struggles or critical race theory is rooted in Marxism. And we know Marxism is from the philosopher Karl Marx, which is he's German, and he basically spent his entire life writing about the idea of how to defeat this concept of capitalism and concept of free market. So the Communist Manifesto, as well as the Das Kapital, really systematically summarized a lot of these ideas. So, for example, the idea of class struggle is a core concept of Marx's writing. And that idea is about the one group of people is always oppressed, whether they are the working class, or a certain race, certain skin color, or maybe they have a certain set of professions that they belong to, that they always rank themselves as a lower class citizen because of those identifiers. And when you apply that to education, it gets dangerous because, like I just mentioned, it makes people feel like the only way to get out of that and identifier is by some sort of a revolution.
And so it seems like this hasn't happened overnight. So when do you think this shift started happening in America?
Really took off in the 90s, where you had a big influx of Chinese nationals into California and other places, many of them still loyal or beholden or compromised by the Communist Party of China. And then you had organizations like the Committee of 100 set up in the early 90s by Henry Kissinger and others. And there's a big an alliance of American Chinese business leaders, cultural leaders, political leaders who are basically pushing the communist Chinese line in this country. They're involved in American media, American politics, American culture, American elections, Black Lives Matter. All of it is manifestations of Communist Party influence in this country.
So with Black Lives Matter, the executive director was herself a self-proclaimed Marxist, and she's since stepped down. But why do you think so many people were okay with following a, Marxist ideology?
We all believe in justice, but social justice means forced redistribution of wealth or socialism. But it sounds a lot more attractive than socialism. Anti-racism sounds a lot more attractive than racial division and racial hatred. But it's the same thing. But it sounds so much better. And so twice as many people support it. The communists are great at semantics. They're great at twisting and using the meanings of the word so that their messaging, when they use a word, we get one meaning from it, but their supporters get another. So this is going to create tension. This is going to create turmoil. And this could lead to a civil war in the United States. And the Communist Party of China would be rubbing their hands in glee because that's what they want to do. They want this country to devolve into chaos so that when they start their planned invasion, they'll be marching into a conquered country.
Fundamental idea, I think, about that it gains traction in America is there is this audience for socioeconomic improvement. And of course, now there are still poor people and there's still rich people. And so the separation of the poor and rich is still there. And so that's why it gains traction. Now, why has it also gained a lot of traction is through higher education. In the 60s, when communism in its definition was very much opposed in America, but creeping in the corner was a different form of communism, and it took a different name. It actually manifested as almost a socialist or sort of a anti-war or a counterculture revolution in the 60s. And those people that participated in the events, the socialists or the communists of the 60s, they went into higher education. They became professors. They became influential people. They became celebrities. So can you imagine now, since the 60s, those people have educated 2 or 3 generations of Americans. And so throughout time, now that we're 50 years after that period, 60 years after that period, those ideas have become the normal thing. So this is not a generation thing. It's actually a multiple generation event. So this evolution in itself is a process of, because America is a free society, we're allowed to say what we want, think how we want. It has allowed these ideas to manifest. And so higher education has been the breeding ground of what they're calling new liberal ideas. But in reality, a lot of these are the communist ideas that radical individuals have taken into higher education.
So where do you see that leading and going forward?
We talk about critical race theory, which is all the buzz right now. Now, that was invented by pro-Soviet communists in this country. People, back in the 90s, critical theory came out of the Frankfurt School, German communists who came to America in the 30s. And their idea was to criticize every aspect of American society, drag it through the mud. And then you had the white privilege scenario that came out of Noel Ignatin and Ted Allen, two former leaders of the pro-Chinese Communist Party, the Provisional Organizing Committee. So they promoted this idea of white privilege and white guilt. So if you're white, you're automatically guilty for every act of oppression in the country. And so the only way you can expiate that guilt is to become an anti-racist, to support Black Lives Matter, to virtue signal, to show how militantly anti-racist you are. And critical race theory has basically been using the energy of these disaffected young Black kids who believe that America's racist, and these gullible white kids who believe they're responsible for all the sins of America going back to the days of slavery. They're all busily working together to carry out the revolution, to carry out the socialist revolution. See, critical race theory is simply Marxism applied to race rather than class. So critical race theory means that the oppressed peoples of color, together with their white allies, will take up and rise up and take the power of the white capitalist patriarchy. So it's just as revolutionary as the old Marxist doctrine, but it's more powerful, it's more divisive because it's applied to race rather than class. And there are many more racial divisions in this country than there are class divisions. You can start out dirt poor and end up filthy rich. You can start out filthy rich and end up dirt poor, but your race is always with you.
So what are some steps to either mitigate or stem those risks?
We've got to resist that in every level. Get rid of critical race theory in your schools, every state's got to be getting it out of their government. Private companies have got to get it out of their systems, because this is Marxism. Get rid of all the Confucius institutes. Stop dealing with the Communist Party of China. Stop buying their goods. The main thing is take a moral stand and be bold about this. Show some leadership that you oppose the Communist Party of China and what it's trying to do to this country.
Well, I think the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, has recently signed a bill to teach to be aware of communism in America, and as well as Arizona recently had a bill introduced to also teach anti-communism ideas in the classroom. So we're seeing right now a showdown, a competition between critical race theory and anti-communism ideas in the classroom. But I really think it has to go back to the roots. So we can't prepare people for the next generation unless we can tell them first why these things are bad. And to start telling them they're bad, we have to find a way to reach those, not those that understand, but those that don't understand. So what I think is a good way is to continue to point out the ideas hidden in the theories that they think are normal now.
So what are some ways you think people can learn to realize what these hidden meanings are?
Well, there's some great books out there. I would go to the PragerU videos. They really explain a lot of this. I would go to the 9 commentaries on the Communist Party. That also explains a lot of the terminology that the communists use and how they twist the meaning of words to make it, to the opposite, really. As I said, democracy to a communist means communism. That's not what we think of as democracy. If the Communist Party of China is not stopped, we will see our cities turned into war zones. We will see police leave in record numbers. They were doing the same police brutality lies back in the 1940s and 50s that they're doing today. Exactly the same terminology. They want to just destroy the police because the police are the bedrock. The police are what keeps our community safe and give people confidence to go about their business freely and unmolested, create wealth, educate themselves, all of that. That's what the police guarantee. If they can destroy the police, they destroy people's confidence in the existing system. And destroying people's confidence in the system is a prime requisite for revolution. You've got to destroy the existing social order and the people's confidence in the existing social order before you can overthrow it and impose your social order. Believe me, when the communists, if they take over, they will have police. They will have more police than we've ever seen before. And they'll be far more brutal and far more lawless than anything we've ever seen. It's not that the communists hate police. It's they hate decentralized police. They hate police who follow the rule of law. They want police who will follow the dictates of the Communist Party to oppress the people, as they do in China, as they do in Cuba, as they do in Venezuela. Here, the police are the servants of the people. They want to turn them into the servants of the party and the oppressors of the people.
And in a way, it almost seems like there's a sort of indoctrination happening and say, because in America, there's freedom of speech. But nowadays, it seems to the point like if someone says something, but enough people disagree with it, that person then gets canceled. And it almost seems like a mob rule. How do you see that as playing out?
Your freedom of speech is actually only freedom of speech if you fit those checkpoints, those the criteria. So what they do is they would say, well, since you don't fit our criteria, then that's not politically correct enough to be said as a part of free speech. And so we don't allow you to say it. Now, a really good example of this is if you take a look at what's been happening with big tech and censoring conservative personalities, not all conservatives, but many of them are conservative, is that they protect free speech only based on their own set of rules. And so political correctness has been a big tool of that, is whatever is politically correct becomes the new norm. So there's no set definition of freedom of speech. It's just whatever is evolving to fit the agenda of those in power.
Well, you go back to the Chinese Cultural Revolution of the 60s. See, so when the Maoists took over, they did this in Cambodia because that's symbols of the past. They're trying to create a new society. So when they took over China, it took them a while to stamp out the old customs and the old traditions. And the Cultural Revolution of the 60s was the final push to get rid of the history and the culture and the old ways of China. So you had young kids, 6, 7 years old, denouncing their parents, burning books, teenagers rampaging through the streets, dragging professors around and torturing them, ripping down statues, destroying artworks. They were eliminating everything. In Cambodia, they killed everybody with glasses, eyeglasses, because if you had eyeglasses, you must be an intellectual. And they didn't want intellectuals because they had old ideas. They had to wipe out the whole intellectual class to have a lumpen proletariat of peasants and farmers that they could then mold into a new society. So every old form of speech had to be suppressed. Every old symbol had to be eliminated. Well, what are they doing in America today? Ripping down statues, denigrating the founding fathers, cancelling out conservatives, patriots, Christians, anti-communists. Anybody who stands for what America used to be must be cancelled. Now, the Chinese have got the Communist Party of China have got some advantage they didn't have back in the 60s. They have high tech now. They have TikTok. They have control of Facebook. They have control of Twitter. They have control of Google. So they can cancel us, not just by, putting a dunce cap on us and having a mock trial of us in the town square. They can just take down our websites. They can destroy our businesses. They can shut us up for saying something incorrect about something they don't like. So the cancel culture we are seeing today is the Chinese Cultural Revolution with technology. But it's the same thing. It's to destroying everything that was traditional about America to create a new socialist culture. And that's all it is. It's Maoist, essentially. And it's everywhere.
Well, great. Thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me, Tiffany.
Always a pleasure. Thanks very much, Tiffany.
And for those just tuning in, that was today's special episode on the rising threat of communism in America, with special guests, author and speaker Trevor Loudon and host of Talking Points, David Zhang. The links will be down in the description down below where you can check out their shows. Thanks for watching China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer, and see you soon.